scenario, then to build in remote rural areas of emerging economies could perhaps combine the high-tech formwork and using local materials and deliberately perhaps labor intensive. And that, as a proposition, working with Lafarge-Holcim, led to a project which brought together 5 universities. Here you can see in Madrid, looking at creating vaults using local material, but in this case the proposition was a material made by Lafarge-Holcim, and that led eventually to the creation of a demonstration full-size cell. The idea was that cells could come together to create community centres, drone ports, and this now has become a permanent pavilion at the Venice Biennale, and that's the team of students and advisors. And this idea of stretching vault-like structures, which is rooted very much in an anonymous tradition, Catalan vault so-called, but occurs in many Mediterranean countries. This one, in its past, the idea of double-shelled domes, and here in Mexico Airport, stretching those materials, the performance, to create heroic spans. Here, the main span of 170 meters, and the termination of those being funnels to move air and light. A significant advance on the last built airport, Beijing Airport here, where that large span is broken down with columns into traditionally 35, 38 meters. And one project under construction, Kuwait Airport, and seeing that I talked about the scale of the Apple Ring, just superimposing that, you can see the circle on the left-hand side, the first phase, currently under construction, and there a composite vault, and using the double skin of steel and concrete to create deep light wells, to modify the climate, and to create a heroic scale with 60-meter cantilevers marking the entrance. And here you can see that composite montage superimposed on the building site. If we're in the desert here, then in that similar environment in Abu Dhabi, the proposition was a series of experiments called Masdar. I'm going back some 10 years now, and those experiments demonstrated the feasibility of a totally solar-powered community. Several thousand people, a university devoted to the study of renewable energy, and here 24 hours, 7 days a week, totally powered by this 10 megawatt solar field, which is only using 40% of the energy generated by that. And again, those themes that I brought up at the beginning, how do you learn from history? How do you learn from a civilization that was able to create very agreeable environments, externally and internally, in an age before you could throw a switch and have plentiful, cheap energy? How did you work with nature? And if you look at this typical city of a region, of a desert region, then the heat of the desert, something like 66 degrees, is modified by the urbanity of the streets in the way in which they create shade. They're scaled to the individual, they're not scaled to the motor vehicle, which was one important lesson, which is why the motor vehicle goes below the pedestrian level in Masdar. And traditionally, courtyards which would create a microclimate with vegetation, evaporative cooling, and finally, in the inner sanctum of the home, a comfortable 27 degrees. Interesting to compare the desert with the temperature, the felt temperature in the center of Abu Dhabi, with its tarmac, with its typical kind of Western response to a very specific climate. So learning from history, the center of Masdar, the streets and so on, are a very, very comfortable 33 degrees, less than half the felt temperature in the city itself. And if we very quickly just look at some of the material developments, one side of this public space is the residential units for the students. The other side of the space is the university itself. Two very different surface treatments. The residences learn from the desert. They use desert sand as an aggregate for the outer layer. Again, learning from history, but using modern technology. Behind that, as a deliberate gap to allow the movement there, is recycled aluminium. The university itself learns in this experiment from space technology, where the challenge is how do you create extraordinary high level of insulation against intense heat, much hotter than the desert, but lightweight, high performance. And here, a very beautiful texture, inflatable pillows backed by the reflective aluminium, using the principles essentially of a microwave oven. So in moving into a future, how do we move from the dirty carbon-producing power generation to cleaner forms of energy? And here, if I see that blue cast of those photovoltaic cells, and I look down on this particular image of an informal settlement in Mumbai, then that blue is not the blue of solar harvesting, it's the blue of plastic. And one of the propositions of my foundation, which was referred to earlier, working with students, working with MIT, and on other aspects with ETH, how could you regenerate an informal settlement from within as an alternative to bulldozing? Could you respect the community fabric which exists within those settlements? That is a very interesting proposition, and one that is challenging the foundation, its graduate students who come to workshops. And one of the elements is materials. And it is fascinating that dominantly an informal settlement uses two materials. It uses plastic sheet and corrugated tin. And I think it's a very interesting challenge to industry to move forward in terms of materials which would have the same availability but would deliver higher performance standards. This, of course, is a city, and cities are not only the present reality, they are indeed the future. And by 2050, 68% is predicted to be urban. And 1 in 3 individuals will be in an informal settlement, a slum, without access to clean water, without modern sanitation, and without power. Some or all of those elements. And that is a challenge which I would love one day to elaborate in a talk. It would be more than 40 minutes in itself. It's a reminder that cities consume 70% of the global energy, but they generate wealth. Extraordinary wealth. And as we see changes in mobility, automation, robotics, electrification, clean energy, without doubt, mobility, aerial mobility, horizontal mobility will change and will call into question, because there will not be the byproducts of fertilizer for agriculture. And why would you do agriculture in the country where it's removed from its eventual market, where water will be scarce, when you could do urban farming with far less water and transform the city of the future into a green future? And one of many optimistic visions of that is how would London look in 2050, 50 years? Would it be green? Would mobility be different? Our Swiss Re building, an office building at the moment, in its future, would offices still command that kind of space? Or would it be an urban farm? And the countryside consumed by vast road networks, if all that is so-called platooning, and the cars can go nose to tail, dense streams, safer, cleaner, that's leisure time, and if that evaporates, then what in turn happens to the countryside? One of many propositions. If it was gone global, then it just seemed interesting perhaps to finish on a local. So thinking globally and acting locally. So I just taken 2 or 3 projects which are geographically close. Manchester was the city of my birth, and revisiting it for a charity called Maggie's, in honor of Charles James' wife, Maggie, who died of cancer, and created this charity to counsel, to create a home-like setting where if you had been diagnosed with cancer, then you would find advice, comfort, information, and that kind of homely quality is the building at the end of the road there. Sustainably timber construction, mechanized, eventually terminating in a conservatory, a greenhouse which would grow plants, the plants would decorate the interior spaces, and a home-like atmosphere literally around the kitchen table. And that theme of wood, of recycling, how would you not only recycle a building, how would you recycle a village? This is a village in Graubünden, in the Swiss Alps, and it's called La Punt. And I was approached interestingly, a party at home by somebody who visited the foundation in Madrid and was so inspired and said, I'd like to share some ideas. And it turns out that this village of 800 people, last year, 40 people left, 5% of the population, young people, to go to the city. And the challenge was, could you create a center that would bring people from tech industries in cities like Zurich, London, as far as Tel Aviv, to create a third kind of visitor, a working visitor, who would be attracted to the lifestyle that this area could offer, and a way place. The inspirations were the architecture of the local villages, which again was a response at a time before cheap energy, so deep, insulating, windows recessed, white painted to pour more light in through a small opening, very, very protected. The other inspiration was the landscape, and perhaps a third inspiration, an artist, the Swiss artist Matthias Becher, very revered, extraordinary individual, and his paintings are really a combination of the architecture and the mountains, the landscape. So taking the site which here you can see in red, and learning from history, and also trying to fit sympathetically into a historic environment, could you create around the edge a kind of overcoat, a kind of perimeter, which would be very protective and generate spaces within which would be echoed externally, the volumes, in a mountain-like way using local materials. So if I pulled myself down to the street level on the nearest corner there, this is what I'd see. If I looked at those taller volumes, those would be the working spaces. And here you would be bringing the local community, the local butcher's shop into it, cafe, crafts, so it would be the interaction with the working visitors and the local community. Interestingly, this month, this project will be voted on, and that community, and I personally got involved with the community, presenting at town hall meetings, meeting the new politicians, very young, 20 years old, 24, 34, the newly elected council. So in this wonderfully democratic process, that community will this month vote whether they want this building or not. If you look inside the working spaces, if you imagine going outside there through the opening, you'd be into a kind of village within a village. And then the final space, which is the equivalent of the village square within the building. Now, that building was in turn development from another building, which is this one here. Also, this is about 20 minutes drive away from the little village. And this residential building is a combination of high-tech, prefabricated elements that were made in a factory, that were shipped to the site, that were assembled with a minimum of disruption, but then combined with something which is very local, the tradition of shingles, individual pieces of larch which are hand-cut, something like $250,000 for this building, and then with a high-tech device applied around the exterior. And this is the terrace. And if I home in on the detail of that wall in the background, then that is the wall. And this cannot get more personal, because this is my home, this is our family home in Graubünden, created 20 years ago. And that local, large, recyclable, sustainable, looks as fresh as ever, and a maintenance-free life for at least 100 years. On that note, thank you.